So this is a lecture on property or ownership. The YouTube page will have a link to this PowerPoint file. What I have to say is, to a good extent, based on joint work with John Robinson, and email me with any comments or questions. It's a classical liberal perspective, I think it's fair to say. Does that mean natural law, natural rights? Yes and no. I'd say okay with qualifications, and a special emphasis on Hume and Smith, who I'm particularly avid about. This is the Duke from this movie. He disarmed a guy who was waiting for him, a possible enemy, and once they make peace, the Duke tosses the gun back to him and says, "Your property, sir." And that manner of speaking, speaking of the object as the property, is very much something I want to follow here. So the model of ownership and property is that we have an owner, Jim, and an object, which is the property. And the ownership can be understood as this sort of claim Jim has against others messing with the object, with the property. And this here is messing by his neighbors and other jural equals. So ownership you can think of as a claim to not have the property messed with. And I do think it's healthy to think of rights as claims. They're not necessarily indefeasible, they're claims, they're meaningful claims. You can think of this as excluding others, so it's a kind of exclusion of others from messing. And a presumptive dominion over the property. A man's home and is his soul kind of idea. Now, the word ownership was not used in Adam Smith's time, as this engram chart shows. What word did they use? Well, as a matter of fact, for ownership, they also often used property, as David Hume says here, relation betwixt a person and an object, and here. So the word property in their day functioned not only for the object, but for the ownership of the object. I just want you to note that, not that it plays any significant role here. So what objects does Jim own? I want to especially focus on things that Hume spoke of. We are possessed of the internal satisfaction of our minds, the external advantages of our bodies. He spoke of the fixed and constant advantages of the mind and body. So most notably, there's this, the person. Jim does not have a soul. Jim is a soul. He has a person. So I want you to think of your person as one of these objects you own, in effect, because what you are is a soul. All this is very much in line with this excellent piece by David Friedman, where he focuses on the special control and knowledge we have of mind and person. And this has a strategic effect, a control effect that lends itself to it being a natural focal point to accord people self-ownership. He calls it natural property. I wouldn't also speak of it as primeval property. That's not to deny that, of course, many times our ownership of ourselves was violated and trampled upon, but still, it's a way of thinking about natural developments. I would also want to include in primeval property immediate possession. Say I have a tool in my hand, immediate possession. Now, Adam Smith started with immediate possession, including that natural property in your own person, and spoke of extending the idea outward. He speaks of extension of the idea of property, a kind of progressive propertization of objects. Like the tool, we learn conventions such that the tool is still mine after I've been separated from it for a while, or the tent I built, or the animals that I'm raising, and then eventually the land, because that comes later. And then in commercial society, he spoke of life and person, property and possessions. Now I'm folding those together as just property. And then promises due, or consent and contract. And the rules of these are commutative justice. So property is, this primary staple of commutative justice, along with promises due or consent. You can put all of this of commutative justice together as a kind of stuff, that's including the contract stuff, and state this virtue of not messing, of commutative justice, as not messing with other people's stuff. And in historical context, communities tend to develop rules about what counts as stuff, whose it is, whether it's anybody's, it could be unowned, and what counts as messing with it. And those rules vary. Each historical community, might have some variation. Just like any historical community might have its own language with its own grammar. But these rules of commutative justice are sort of like a social grammar. The rules evolve to be precise and accurate, as Smith puts it, or grammar-like. And then you can flip that virtue around to being a kind of claim, others not messing with your stuff, okay? And with this concept of commutative justice and liberty here, or others not messing with your stuff, we can now see the specialness, especially in modern times when we develop the idea of a modern government, of a special player, a unique, integrated special player, who institutionalizes, in fact, messings with people's stuff, who does things that if anyone else tried would be considered definitely criminal. And that's the government, or the jural superior. So we have two jural relationships working in these thinkers: you and your neighbor, equal, equal, and then superior, inferior, or governor and governed. And this concept of others not messing with your stuff is called security, like home security, when it's about keeping burglars from your home, in equal relationships, and liberty in the superior inferior jural relationship. Okay. So now we can go back to our picture of Jim and his ownership of the property and add another claim oval here. And this is his claim against messing by the government. I realize this claim is often disregarded and trampled upon, but the idea is, the hope is that in a liberal nation state, this claim will have some traction. There'll be some presumption of liberty here. And here again, I want to point out that the concept of exclusion works fine. If the government restricts me, let's say, in what I can do with my property, suppose with a land use regulation, it might not look like I have an exclusion issue, but it's there implicitly or in threat. That is to say, if I proceed to build something on my land that they said I am not to build, and then I disregard their notices to say, take that down and pay a penalty or something, they will eventually invade my property with guns drawn. So enforcement does, get right at the issue of exclusion whenever we're talking about these sort of governmental interventions or restrictions. Okay, so this is the two jural relationships here in the two ovals. So just some quick examples. If an equal, a neighbor, did a nuisance to Jim and his property, you can think of that as a tort. That's in the dark blue area or lines. Alternatively, it could be a voluntary agreement between Jim and a neighbor, for example, granting an easement. The way I am inclined to parse that is that Jim is making a contract. Like, he still owns the land, but the other guy now has promises due in the form of the easement. promises to enable him to use the land. Similarly with covenants on property, a condominium, I would consider the inner drywall and electrical outlets and such as my property if I'm the condo owner. And then outside of that, there's the beams that I would say, and the structure and larger building is owned by the association. And I have a contract with them to use that space within their property, okay, and within which my property then sits, my drywall and furniture and so on. So these are just some ways to understand how this concept works. Now, to go to some governmental restrictions, if the government imposes zoning restrictions on the landowner, I just see that as a messing with his property. I'm not saying that therefore it's undesirable. In this classical liberal point of view, it doesn't preclude desirable intervention, desirable restrictions, right? Smith made exceptions and so on. But it is a messing with. It is an initiation of coercion. Similarly, if the government required you to let people cross your land, so they sort of they imposed a government ordered easement on your property. Taxation is a taking, a messing with. Drug prohibition. Intellectual property is an interesting one. I am inclined to parse this by saying that, let's say I have a patent, that actually the patent is a privilege and it's actually a restriction on what other people can do with their property. Namely, they can't use it to mimic this something that I've patented. So I don't actually, strictly speaking, see IP as P. That's not to say we shouldn't have it, and that's also not to say that we shouldn't, acquiesce to the common vocabulary. But strictly speaking, I don't actually see it as property. Now, there was a watershed from about 1880 in the world, in Western civilization. I'm speaking especially of the Anglosphere, where words lost or changed meaning. In fact, the most central words of our civilization. You can learn more about that at this website. And all sorts of expressions rose up expressing the mentality of governmentalization. And of course, government grew enormously, and we got totalitarianism and everything else in this kind of period of a collapse of liberalism. For example, social justice had no currency. It's one of these here, had no currency before 1890. Like most, these terms here did not have currency. You can see this whole trend by tracking new liberal and old liberal, as liberal itself changed meaning. It's one of those words that lost or changed meaning. But bundle of rights is one of these expressions, and it comes from this period. You could see it in Commons and in Eli, progressives of the 1890s, John Maurice Clark. Here's a guy who is actually classical liberal, and it's interesting that as early as 1913, he's saying, he's talking about ownership in the manner more or less like I've been talking about it. And he says, we are accustomed to regard these terms as denoting a bundle of rights. It's remarkable that by 1913, he's already saying we're accustomed to this expression. He goes on to say, accurately, however, they indicate merely a single right, and that the right of freedom. That's again, this ownership, this exclusion, the dominion. And it's a claim of freedom. It's not indefeasible. So bundle of rights is one of these expressions that gets started around 1880 and grows after that. These are some of the modern critics of bundle of rights, and they point out that the motivation for advancing bundle talk was political. Those people sought to deprivilege property to facilitate more extensive collective control over property. So how does bundle subvert classical liberal semantics and the presumptions that those semantics carry? That's really so important. That's why when someone says, oh, that's just a semantic issue, very often that's a very wrong-headed remark because semantics are very important. Culture is very important. Anyway, bundle means bound collection of things from a Dutch word to bind. And if you have a shopping list and you collect the things on the list, you then have a bundle of groceries and so on. The connotations of this, the objects bound together are distinct, are listable, had been apart or separate, were brought together and bound together by someone. There is a bundler. Does it look like a bundle, though, Jim's ownership of this property? I don't see any list, right? I don't see anything, it's just him and this claim against messing with, a claim against his neighbors and a claim against the government. So no, it's not a bundle at all. Consider the expression, the human body is a bundle of organs. And consider the connotations. Well, you might say that the organs are distinct. I don't know if we talked about cells or something. It might be a lot harder to say they're distinct and listable. But then what about had been apart or separate? No, that's not true at all. Had been brought together, bound together by somebody. There is a bundler. No, not true at all. That's why it sounds strange to say the human body is a bundle of organs. And the human body is really not only an analogy here. Again, our most fundamental form of property is our person, and in a sense, our property in the extended sense is an extension of that kind of personhood, really. And this relates to the expression one's own. Like, Smith talks about not messing with what is another's and of making a becoming use of one's own. That's another virtue, set of virtues. And that corresponds to suum as it appears in Grotius and Pufendorf, the guys writing in Latin way back when. So it's not a bundle. Again, Merrill and Smith say it was political. The bundle people sought to undermine the notion that property is a natural right and thereby smooth the way for activist state intervention. They say that bundle talk has today become a kind of orthodoxy. Not coincidentally, state intervention greatly increased. Now, I want to focus a little bit on Coase, because Coase is not a progressive, he's not an interventionist, he's a classical liberal, and yet he's very much an affirmer of bundle. And you see this in his work starting in the late 50s and throughout the rest of his life. I see this as a flaw. I'm very high on Coase. I quite adore Coase, in fact, but I do see this as a mar in his corpus. For the reasons I've said, I think bundle is a nefarious term, and it does undermine classical liberalism. I think that's why it was adopted as a slogan. And this problem in Coase relates to this problem, which many have complained about, of a sort of undue causal agnosticism. Coase says, Coase 1960, should A be allowed to harm B, or should B be allowed to harm A? As though you could look at it either way, and there's no particular reason to do it one way or the other. They're sort of on a par. Well, I don't think that's true, generally speaking. In most cases, there is a much more focal way to understand it. If a train is throwing off sparks and those sparks burn down the crops of a nearby farmer, I would say the train has harmed the farmer. If the farmer gets to call an injunction or call for compensation for the burned down crops, I wouldn't call that the farmer harming the train. I mean, there's just a more focal way to see things. There's a more natural way to see things. This is a whole set of focal points. This ownership, Jim's ownership of the property and the claim of others not to mess with it. That's what the rules of commutative justice were selected for this focalness, selected because they gave this baseline sense of causation, in fact. Merrill and Smith speak of this, use the term baselines in just this way. Now, this is Woody Allen coming out of a bar after having his date, Julia, with him, and you can see that some ruffians are in pursuit, and then they rough him up. And then later on, he gets beat up, and later on he comes back to his friends who set him up on the date, and they said, "How did it go with Julia?" And he said, "Well, some guys got rough with Julia, and I had to teach them a lesson. I snapped my chin down onto some guy's fist and hit another in the knee with my nose." Now, according to some frame of reference, this thing of someone punching someone in the chin could be understood as the other guy snapping his chin down onto the guy's fist. I mean, there is a frame of reference where that would be an apt description, but it's not a very focal frame of reference. It's not a very natural one, right? And that's exactly why this is funny in the movie, because he's so changing the natural frame of reference, the natural interpretation, the natural focal points. And so this is a joke basically about undue causal agnosticism. And this kind of reflects, I think, one of this correlate problem in Coase, where he talks bundle. So classical liberal semantics and presumptions are subverted by bundle talk because it effaces ownership, it effaces liberty, and it evades the presumption of liberty. It sloughs off the burden of proof. So why did Coase embrace bundle? I've thought about this. One possible reason is that, broadly speaking, there's the proper way to understand property as exclusion, and then you could deviate from that and choose bundle. But if you go down exclusion, there is then the possibility of understanding this claim as a kind of maxim, the way the classical liberals do, or as a kind of axiom, the way some dogmatic modern libertarians do, like Rothbard. And one problem, particularly perhaps in Coase's heyday, is that if you went the exclusion route and said, it's about people not messing with my stuff, that people are going to accuse him of axiom. People are going to associate him with folks that make much stronger claims about the exclusion. They're going to associate him perhaps with others who were in disrepute at that time, William Graham Sumner, Herbert Spencer, and so on. And so to avoid all of that resistance, just talk bundle, try to make your points talking bundle, and not leave yourself open for this kind of abuse or dismissal. That's sort of an interpretation you might have. So in that way, Coase might join the progressives in talking bundle. It may have given him a way to talk about property and remain respectable. I do think a lot of taboos surround issues of liberty, okay? And it reminds me of other fudgings that go on in talk of liberty. Now, I edit this journal, Econ Journal Watch, and we ran a symposium on bundle, and Coase was invited. I told him when I invited him that Richard Epstein would participate and defend bundle. Now, as an associate of Coase, wrote to me that Coase was very pleased to know that Professor Epstein will be defending the bundle view. He has great confidence in Richard. So I want to turn now to Richard Epstein briefly. I can't do him justice, and offer some friendly criticisms. He's been a friend to the journal and always been friendly to me, so I don't want him to take this the wrong way. I just think that he's a great guy taking a very opposite position. The title of his paper, in fact, is Bundle of Rights Theory as a Bulwark Against Statist Conceptions of Private Property. In this article, he speaks of incidents of property. and one of those incidents is the right to exclude. He appeals to Roman jurisprudence, but he admits that they did not use a word like bundle, and he tries to square bundle with what he calls a bottom-up system of property rights. I think that Professor Epstein, in fact, is eliding the main concern. There's very little in the piece about what I see as the nefarious connotations of bundle. What he is essentially setting forth is that the word bundle means simply an account of these incidents, an account of these facets of ownership. And that's fine. You could make an account of the facets of ownership, just like you could of the facets of fatherhood, the facets of living in Sweden, the facets of this or that. The problem is, why use the word bundle and for that? And you're not going to be able to determine the semantics of the word bundle. The bundle has connotations out there in civilization that are going to be there regardless of what you write in your article or in your book. So I don't really think this is coming to grips with those nefarious connotations. These incidents, also are broad facets. They're not like the particular listed use rights as suggested by bundle theorists, including Coase. So I don't really see the incidents as mapping to what bundle talkers mean by these use rights. I really don't think it fits. Now, he wrote a famous book, Takings, that focused on this clause of the Fifth Amendment, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. And he developed an argument saying that regulation that restricts the use of property, let's say zoning or land use restriction, it's kind of like taking a stick from the bundle. And so just compensation is due. Now, as much as this kind of argument appeals to me for, classical liberal reasons, I don't think, first of all, I don't really see the regulation as a taking, at least not in a very literal sense. If someone took this coffee cup from me, they would then have the coffee cup. They took the coffee cup. Now he has the coffee cup. He can do what he wants with the coffee cup. That's not really what the regulation does. It doesn't take something which they then have. I think that to interpret this clause this way, bundle was a useful concept, and maybe that led Professor Epstein to become more attached to the bundle idea. But I still don't think that vindicates bundle talk anyhow. Overall, he has this sort of compensation precept in his jurisprudential political philosophy. And I have to say, I think he oversells that in terms of its meaningfulness and practicality and so on. Just some brief remarks here. So, as I said, there are these connotations, and I want to address the listable now. Think about a piano. Does a piano enable you to play a bundle of tunes? No, not at all. It's not a list of tunes that the piano, you can play. And similarly, Jim's uses of his property are not a list. It's not listable. And even if he does face a restriction, say the government says he can't build certain things on his land, he's still left with innumerable uses, just as if someone said, hey, on your piano, you cannot play anything in the key of C or these faster tempos. It would still leave you with innumerable tunes you could play. So it's not listable. The whole listable aspect is extremely misleading as well. And by the way, what does the law actually look like? Does it specify a bundle of rights? Consider my car, my property, my car. Does the law anywhere specify my car or my property as a bundle of rights? And the answer is no. The law basically presumes an understanding, a natural understanding of property. And when we have laws that attenuate ownership, it's expressed as attenuations. It's expressed as restrictions on that, as messings with, essentially, although they won't necessarily call themselves that. Restrictions on, what you can do with your property, kind of like telling the guy with the piano he can't play tunes in a certain key. David Friedman captures this in the final sentence of his fine article. He says, legal rules are in large part a superstructure erected upon an underlying structure of self-enforcing rights. See, we have this commutative justice in our bones and in our equal relationships. And that's one reason to be hopeful about liberty, because no matter how bad the government gets, we're always going to see the precept of not messing with other people's stuff between each other. And we're always going to be able to think, wouldn't it be nice if the government were more like that and followed that healthy grammar-like precept? So James Penner, one of the other great critics of bundle theory, says property as a bundle of rights is little more than a slogan. The use of the word slogan is not intended to be merely polemical. By slogan, I mean an expression that conjures up an image, but which does not represent any clear thesis or set of propositions. I agree with that. Collectivism used to be more coherent. Hobhouse, one of the promulgators of new liberalism, said the progressive trend is toward making England the property of the English nation by the application of the principle of public overlordship. You can find numerous franker statements in that day and age. Earlier, the classical liberal Tocqueville spoke of, quote, the view that all the landed estates in the kingdom had in the first instance been granted to their occupants conditionally and that their true owner was the state. This idea is basic to our modern socialism. So I think the best way to understand this is to think of a substratum of earth underneath the territory of the polity. And the presumption in this collectivist configuration of ownership is that that substratum is collectively owned by the citizens. And so they do have an ownership upon which all other property inside of the polity is sitting, and hence enveloped in a contract. And they interpret government law as voluntary contract, as though government were the voluntarily appointed officers of a voluntary organization. But I think that even this view proceeds upon certain traditional baselines and the logic of ownership and exclusion. It's just a different configuration in a fundamental way of this substratum and then governmental procedure. Now, over here after the point B, we've got the liberal configuration of ownership. That's what I would affirm, and I think Adam Smith and David Hume would affirm, which rejects that collectivist substratum idea. And so I'm down here at point G in terms of where I finish up. And then over here from B is this collectivist configuration thinking, no, I see it this way with kind of Club USA or Hotel USA with that substratum collectively owned. So I think those are better positions. And then up above B are people who don't even, going over here the other way, who don't even own up to these ways of seeing things and these choices to make, these conceptual and semantic choices to make. And then down the collectivist configuration, you could have people who say, oh, I kind of see what you liberals would want to say, and I kind of see your shadow idea of liberty if you were right. And so they might sort of understand what they're doing, as it were. So I see bundle talk most attractive to those, and then there's those who don't own up to that. And so I see bundle talk as most attractive to those at nodes D and E over here, and that those at F and G should see that bundle is incoherent. Anyhow, so to conclude, we've talked about natural or primeval property, extensions outward to other objects, ownership as a claim against messing, exclusion, commutative justice being property and promises due, contract, and it being grammar-like. Flip that, liberty, presumption of liberty, we hope we had in the liberal era, that unfortunately got subverted after 1880. But when the pitch here is that when the government treads on liberty, it should admit it and thereby bear a burden of proof. The presumption of liberty is the spine of liberal civilization. The liberal plan, as Smith put it, he said, should be plain and intelligible to common understandings. And that's what I think that this view of property is, and is part of why it's wise and sound. Thank you for your attention.